Red Zone. The countdown clock has just a few final seconds left in the game. More than 70,000 fans leap to their feet, their cheers crashing down onto the field like an earthquake. Philip Rivers drops back 3 steps, the defense rushes in, and amid the maze of colliding bodies, Antonio Gates breaks free from coverage with a clean, ruthless move. He spins, leaps high between 2 burly defenders, his hands outstretched precisely like a rebound back in his Kent State days. The ball settles into his palms, clutched tight against his chest. His 2 cleats hit the ground in the end zone. Touchdown. The stadium explodes. And in that moment, Antonio Gates isn't just a player, he's an NFL monument. Over 16 full seasons with the San Diego then Los Angeles Chargers, he earned 8 Pro Bowl selections, 3 first-team All-Pro honors, and a spot on the NFL's All-Decade Team of the 2000s. He finished his career with 955 receptions, 11,841 yards, and 116 touchdowns, the number that once set the all-time record for most touchdowns by a tight end. He and Philip Rivers formed one of the most effective and enduring quarterback-tight end duos in league history. He was inducted into the Chargers Hall of Fame and mentioned alongside the greatest legends at his position. To millions of fans, Antonio Gates is the symbol of consistency, loyalty, and elite-level play, a path that seemed destined for glory. But that's only half the story. Antonio Gates never played a single down of college football. No NCAA stats, no big-time university pedigree to launch from. He went undrafted in the NBA after pouring his entire youth into the dream of basketball. He also went undrafted in the NFL no-hat, placed on his head under the flashbulbs and applause. He entered America's most brutal league as an outsider, an experiment, a long-shot gamble few believed would pay off. Every practice was a fight to prove he belonged. Every hit was a reminder that he hadn't taken the usual route like everyone else. While the world saw a confident star, a cold-blooded red zone specialist, he lived with the quiet fear that one day people would realize he never truly belonged here. He carried 2 parallel lives, one shining under stadium lights, and one in the shadows of doubt, where sheer will and discipline were the only things keeping him upright. For 20 years, the crowd bought the legend. Antonio Gates just tried not to let his fear show through the roar. If you want to uncover the truth behind that spotlight, and understand why Antonio Gates had to fight in silence for 2 decades, hit subscribe to the channel right now. But before the red zone, before the stadium-shaking cheers and the records etched into NFL history, there was a city that promised no mercy. Detroit in the 80s and 90s wasn't a glittering picture of the American dream. It was a city grappling with the collapse of the auto industry, shuttered factories, abandoned blocks, old brick houses stained with time and disappointment. In many neighborhoods, poverty wasn't the exception, it was the norm. Police sirens in the night, red and blue lights sweeping through windows. Stories of violence spreading faster than good news, all of it formed the familiar rhythm of life. Kids growing up there learned to watch before they stepped, to stay quiet before they dared to dream. That city didn't promise to lift you up. It tested you. Every single day, Antonio Gates's family knew that all too well. In an environment where one wrong turn could send you sliding forever, they chose discipline as their guardrail. Curfews weren't about distrust. They were about fear for their child's future. School wasn't optional. It was mandatory. Sports weren't just fun. They were the only door that might lead out of the neighborhood. In that house, love wasn't loud. It showed up in stern reminders, in worried glances when their son walked out the door each morning, in the quiet hope that this boy wouldn't be swallowed by the city. Antonio grew up in an atmosphere that was both strict and full of expectation. He understood he didn't have much room for mistakes. Young Antonio was much taller than his peers, broad shoulders, long arms, a body built for sports. But inside that frame was a more sensitive soul than people realized. He wasn't the loud kid, not the one starting trouble to prove himself. He observed, thought deeply, and felt the invisible pressure surrounding him keenly. He knew the shortcuts in the neighborhood could lead where. He knew familiar faces could vanish after just one summer. And so he clung to basketball like a life raft in rushing water. On cracked concrete courts, where rims could be crooked and nets torn, Antonio found another world. There, the steady bounce of the ball gave him a sense of control. There, his height and vertical leap became advantages, not burdens. Basketball quickly outgrew being a hobby. It became his language to the world, the place he felt he had worth. Every strong rebound, every decisive dunk was a declaration that he could rise above his circumstances. In high school, he stood out not just for his physical gifts, but for his determination. He stayed late, practiced extra when others went home. He looked toward the NBA as his only horizon. In that teenager's mind, there was no such thing as a backup plan. The NBA wasn't just fame or money. It was escape from the limits Detroit seemed to have drawn for him. It was the chance to pull his family out of constant worry, to prove his parents' discipline and sacrifice weren't for nothing. Antonio went to college as a basketball player, still pouring all his faith into the orange ball. He didn't spend time imagining himself in NFL pads. He didn't dream of red zone catches. Football, to him back then, was just another sport on TV. Everything he saw ahead was an NBA contract, a draft night where his name got called, a fresh start for the whole family. What makes this story so heartbreaking is that he truly believed that was the only path. If basketball failed, he had no plan B, no prestigious degree waiting, no powerful connections, no alternate dream. Every hope, every effort, every prayer funneled into one single direction. In Detroit, you weren't taught to prepare for multiple scenarios. You were taught to survive and grip the rare opportunity that appeared. Antonio Gates grew up believing basketball would save him, and that absolute belief, pure yet reckless, is what made the journey that followed both fated and painful. Because when a kid stakes his entire future on one dream, he's never truly ready for the day that dream might not choose him. And then that night came, the night Antonio Gates believed would open the door out of Detroit. NBA Draft Night. The small living room was quieter than usual. The TV glowed, blue light flickering on the walls, on the tense faces of family waiting. No one said much. No one dared say much. No one dared say much. Everyone understood what the evening meant. Years of training, years believing basketball was the only way, years placing the whole future into one moment when his name would be called. Antonio sat leaning slightly forward, hands clasped. He tried to look calm, but his heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. Picks ticked by. Other names were announced. Other guys walked on stage, put on new team hats, hugged family amid cheers. Each name felt like another door slamming shut. The phone sat on the table. It lay there like proof of hope. People glanced at it more than the screen. Just one call. Just one team believing he was worth it. But the phone didn't ring. It stayed silent, cruelly. The final pick of the first round passed, then the second round. Time stretched like it was distorted. Each minute felt like an hour. Each time the announcer read another name, Antonio felt something inside him shrink. He said nothing. His family said nothing. No one dared meet each other's eyes. Because if they did, they'd have to admit what was happening. By the end of the night, the phone was still silent. It wasn't a loud explosion. No dramatic noise. Just a void. A silence so thick it was hard to breathe. Antonio felt like he was sitting in that room, yet somehow not there anymore, like he was watching himself from the outside. The first feeling wasn't anger, not rage. It was confusion. Maybe they just haven't seen me yet, he told himself. But deep down, another question started echoing. Or maybe I'm not good enough. The feeling of not being good enough is the most toxic thing for someone who's built their entire identity around one dream. Antonio didn't just want to be an NBA player. He had become the guy who's going to the NBA in the minds of his family, his friends, himself. That was how he was seen. That was how he saw himself. And when his name wasn't called, it wasn't just an opportunity denied. An entire identity was shaken. He no longer knew who he was, if not the future NBA player. It felt like being erased from the map, like the sports world had moved on without him. News talked about new rookies, new hopes, new contracts. No one mentioned Antonio Gates, no ticker tape, no breakdowns of his potential. It became the blank space between other people's success stories. And in that living room, he realized a painful truth. The world doesn't owe him anything. That night was the first crack. Not a visible wound, but a fissure in his confidence. He began doubting everything he had once believed in, absolutely. All those late-night practices, all those sacrifices, all those silent promises to his family that he would lift them out of Detroit's limits. If the NBA didn't choose him, had that dream ever truly been his? And if basketball was no longer the path, what did he have left? What made that moment the cruelest was the truth he couldn't bring himself to say out loud. He had no plan B, no alternate route, no backup dream. He had put everything into one door, and that door had just closed in silence. His family finally stood up, turned off the TV. A few words of encouragement were spoken, but they sounded distant, like they were meant for someone else. Antonio nodded, forced a smile. He didn't want anyone to see him break. But when night fell and the house sank into quiet, he lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling for the first time in his life truly lost. That wasn't the final failure of his life, but it was the first time he understood what rejection on that scale felt like. And that cracked the feeling of not being good enough, of being left behind, would follow him long afterward. It would hide beneath touchdowns. It would surface in the quiet moments after victories. Because on the night the phone didn't ring, Antonio Gates didn't just lose an opportunity, he lost certainty about himself. And from that crack, another life began to take shape, the life of a man always trying to prove he deserved to be there. And after the night, the phone stayed silent. A long stillness stretched for weeks. No press conferences, no grand consolations from the media, just the cold reality. The NBA had moved on without Antonio Gates. The days that followed felt like walking through fog. He still trained, still went to the gym, still kept his routine, but a question he couldn't shake had taken root inside. If not basketball, then who am I? It was in that haze that a strange offer began to emerge, a path he had never seriously considered before, trying out for the NFL, football, a sport he had never played in college. A completely different world, with different rules, different pace, different violence. Deciding to switch to the NFL wasn't a heroic moment. It felt humiliating in his own eyes. Because to step into football, Antonio had to admit his first dream had failed. He had to accept starting from scratch as a complete novice. Undrafted, no college pedigree in this sport, no stats to prove anything. He had to convince teams to give him a tryout chance, like a job applicant, without the right degree. For someone who once believed he would walk onto the NBA draft stage, having to beg for a workout felt like swallowing his pride piece by piece. When the San Diego Chargers agreed to give him an undrafted free agent contract, it wasn't recognition. It was a gamble. In many eyes, Antonio Gates was just an experiment, a tall former basketball player with raw physical potential but zero football foundation. In the locker room, he wasn't a star. He was the one who had to prove the most. Coaches looked at him with cold assessment. Could this body withstand NFL hits? Could this mind learn a complex playbook? Did he have the discipline to rewire instincts built from basketball? Those first days in training camp were a shock. Basketball had taught him to leap, balance, read space, but football taught him to endure. Every practice was a series of collisions. No more soft landings after dunks. Instead, direct blows, tackles that knocked the breath out of his chest. He had to relearn his body, learn to lower his center of gravity, learn to use his shoulders to absorb instead of dodge, learn to block men dozens of pounds heavier. His muscles ached in entirely new ways. Bruises appeared in places he didn't know could bruise. But the hardest part was learning to get knocked down in front of millions. In the NBA, if he failed, he could tell himself it was part of a game he understood. In the NFL, every fall felt like the whole world watching his inexperience. The media called him the basketball experiment. Commentators mentioned he had never played college football. Every mistake on the field felt like proof he didn't belong, and deep inside, the crack from that draft night widened just a little more. Some evenings, after practice, Antonio sat alone in his small room, staring at his hands that once dreamed of the NBA and wondered if he was humiliating himself. He had once been a high school basketball star. Now he had to learn basic routes, got yelled at for being in the wrong spot. He had to accept being the least experienced guy in the room. The loneliness wasn't from lacking teammates. It was from no one truly understanding what it felt like to abandon your first dream and step into an entirely new world. But it was in that humiliation that a fierce determination began to form. If he had to start over, he would start over completely. He stayed on the field longer than anyone else. He studied the playbook late into the night. He watched film not for praise, but to find his own mistakes. He turned others' doubt into fuel. Every hit became a reminder he was still here. Every day he wasn't cut was a small victory. Switching to the NFL may have been the most humiliating decision of his life because it forced him to admit prior failure. But that same decision opened another path. Not the one he had dreamed of, not the easy one, but one that demanded he rebuild himself from the ground up under the skeptical gaze of the entire world. And in that solitude, Antonio Gates began to understand that sometimes to survive, you have to accept being seen as a gamble and resolve to prove you're worth more than that. Those first days in training camp were unlike anything Antonio Gates had ever experienced. He didn't step onto the field as a coveted talent. He stepped in as someone who had to justify his existence. On the roster, his name came with no college football credentials, no NCAA stats, no highlight reels replayed on ESPN. The only label attached to him was basketball guy, a former hoops player trying his luck in the NFL. An experiment, a gamble. The very first practice taught him a painful lesson. When facing an experienced linebacker, Antonio ran his route with basketball instincts, head high, long strides, trusting his agility. But football isn't the open space of a basketball court. It's close-quarters combat. The hit came faster than he expected. A direct blast to his shoulder and chest, hard enough to knock him backward, back hitting the ground, breath stripped from his lungs. A faint chuckle rose somewhere. Not mean-spirited, but enough to make him understand his place. He didn't belong to the class of people who grew up with this sport. He was the one relearning from zero. The practices that followed weren't any gentler. He had to learn blocking a task that didn't exist in basketball in that way. Lower his center, use his body like a shield, accept contact as a given. There were times he got thrown aside like he didn't exist. Times he went down in full view of the team, feeling both physical pain and wounded pride. His body was big, but his experience wasn't. And in the NFL, inexperience can be exposed in a split second. In the locker room, his teammates' looks said everything. No one openly disrespected him. But in the way they talked, in the half-serious jokes, he felt the distance. "Hey, basketball guy." The nickname wasn't outright cruel, but it reminded him every day that he was the outsider. People didn't see him as a real tight end. They saw him as a project, and projects can be scrapped at any time. By day, Antonio trained like a warrior. He stayed after official practice, running extra routes, catching balls from every angle, repeating movements until his muscles shook with fatigue. He watched film for hours, noting every small detail. He tried to master football's language like an adult learning a new tongue, slow, difficult, but quitting wasn't allowed. On the field, he refused to show weakness. Every fall meant getting up faster. Every mistake meant fixing it in the next session. But at night, it was a different story. When the field lights went out, when the cheers and coaches' shouts faded to echoes in his head, Antonio lay alone in the quiet room, and the familiar question returned. Am I a joke? He remembered the morning's hit, remembered his teammates' looks, remembered the NBA draft night when the phone didn't ring. The feeling of not being good enough didn't disappear. It just changed shape. Now it whispered that maybe he was trying to force his way into a world that wasn't meant for him. There were nights he imagined the scene of being cut from the roster. Just a short call from the coaching staff. A thank you for the effort. A plane ticket home. And what would he say to his family then? That he had tried, that he had dared to take the risk, or that he had turned himself into a joke? That fear was invisible to everyone else. On the field, he was still the fastest tight end in the group, the highest jumper when catching the ball. But inside, he was still the young man the NBA had left behind, now trying to prove he wasn't the next mistake. A double life began to take clear shape. By day, he lived as an NFL player training, colliding, calling plays, fighting for every inch on the grass. By night, he lived as a doubter analyzing every mistake, wondering if he was forcing fate down a path that didn't belong to him. Those two lives ran parallel, never fully intersecting, and it was in that tension that Antonio Gates began to change. He no longer trained just to impress. He trained to survive. He understood that if he didn't make it through this phase, his story would end before it truly began. Every time he got knocked flat, he told himself, "At least I'm still here." Every time someone called him basketball guy, he took it as a reminder that he still had so much more to do. A rookie who didn't belong, that was how the world saw him back then. But in the loneliness and humiliation, a quiet resolve was being forged. Not the determination of a star promised glory, but the determination of someone far too familiar with doubt, and this time determined not to let himself be erased from the map again. Then something no one expected happened. Amid the days he was still called basketball guy, amid the collision-filled practices and skepticism, Antonio Gates began to do what even the biggest doubters couldn't deny. He started making his mark. And when Philip Rivers stepped in as the starting quarterback, an invisible bond formed. Rivers saw in Gates what so many others overlooked: a body that understood space, an instinct for reading gaps, the ability to leap and adjust mid-air as if the turf were the hardwood of his basketball days. In close practices, Rivers started throwing to him more, not out of pity, but because he caught it. Then came real games, red zone. Rivers drops back. Gates cuts his route, spins, uses his frame to shield the defender. The ball arrives. Touchdown. For the first time, the stands called his name not with curiosity, but with recognition. A new tight end, a new weapon, and then another touchdown, and another game. The connection between Rivers and Gates became what kept opposing defenses awake at night. Antonio didn't just survive on the roster, he became the quarterback's safest target, a reliable option in the most critical moments. But success didn't arrive like a triumphant liberation. It came like a fresh coat of paint over old cracks. Every touchdown brought cheers, But when the noise died down, Antonio still heard the familiar voice in his head. Do I really deserve this? Every article praising him as the NFL fairy tale unintentionally reminded him he started from a place that didn't belong here. When the media mentioned he never played college football, it was both praise and a lingering shadow. Every touchdown didn't bring peace, it only raised the bar higher. If he scored 8 touchdowns this season, they'd expect 10 next season. If he made the Pro Bowl, they'd demand All-Pro. Success didn't erase the fear, it made the fear more sophisticated. Instead of fearing being cut from the team, he began fearing being exposed as an imposter in a world of lifelong trained players. Imposter syndrome didn't leave when he signed a new contract. It sat next to him in the locker room, whispering that one day someone would look at him and say, "We misjudged this." There were games where he played brilliantly, catching in tight windows, beating 2 defenders, and the crowd rose as if witnessing a miracle. But even in those moments, Antonio still clearly remembered getting knocked flat in that first practice. He remembered his teammates' doubtful looks. He remembered the silent NBA draft night. His success didn't erase those memories, it only cast them into deeper shadow. He feared that if his performance ever dipped, if he ever couldn't haul in the tough catches anymore, it would all collapse as quickly as it came. Philip Rivers believed in him, the team believed in him, the fans believed in him, but others' belief didn't easily become his own. After every game, when he got home, Antonio didn't rewatch highlights to feel proud. He watched film to find mistakes, to spot the half-step slow route, the not quite tight enough block. He didn't allow himself to rest in the spotlight, because in his mind any looseness led to one outcome: being replaced. The explosion alongside Philip Rivers turned him into one of the league's most feared tight ends, but inside he still lived in 2 realities. On the field, he was the symbol of precision and power. Off the field, he was the man always wondering if it could all vanish after just one season. He didn't fear small failures, he feared being proven that his success was just an accident. Imposter syndrome is an invisible enemy. It doesn't need evidence, it only needs silence. And on nights without the roar of the crowd, Antonio heard it louder than ever. But instead of letting that fear paralyze him, he turned it into fuel. If he had spent his youth feeling not good enough, then he would play like someone never allowed to be satisfied. If he had once been erased from the NBA map, then he would carve his name into the NFL, 1 touchdown at a time. Success built on fear. Antonio Gates's success wasn't built from blind confidence. It was built from the fear of being forgotten, from the obsession to prove himself every single day. And that's why, when the world saw a star shining bright, few knew that inside that light was a man who never fully believed he deserved to stand there. But fear wasn't the only thing quietly growing inside Antonio Gates. As the numbers started climbing, touchdowns, yards, Pro Bowls, his body began responding in colder ways. The NFL isn't just a stage of glory. It's a massive machine, and every Sunday is a gear grinding away pieces of anyone brave enough to step into it. At first, it was just the familiar post-game aches, knees throbbing on stairs, shoulders stiffening after hits. He told himself it was the normal price. Everyone in this league pays it, but season after season, the pain didn't fade after a few days off. It stayed. Knees started creaking when he bent down. Back hurt every time he twisted too fast. There were mornings he woke up and had to lie still for a few extra minutes just to muster the courage to put his feet on the floor. His body no longer sprang up like in those early years. It resisted. Some mornings, Antonio got out of bed unable to straighten his back fully. It felt like a steel cable stretched along his spine, pulling tight every time he tried to stand upright. He walked slowly into the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and saw a man aging faster than his years. But that afternoon, he still had to hit the field, still had to run routes, still had to leap between defenders dozens of pounds heavier. Before games, the training room became familiar territory. Tape wrapped around knees, a back brace cinched tight, and then the injections painkillers pumped into his body to numb the signals nature was sending. Not because he wanted to cheat fate, but because in the NFL, readiness is measured by whether you can take the field. If you can stand, you can play. If you can play, you have to endure. The crowd didn't see those things. They saw touchdowns. They saw the red zone catches. They saw the celebratory hand slaps with Philip Rivers. They saw the confident smile after scoring. But Antonio saw the body's bill coming due. Every hit was new debt. Every game was borrowing from the future to pay for the present. He knew there would come a day the body demanded it all back. The NFL is a machine that doesn't stop for one individual. It keeps turning, keeps producing new stars, keeps fading old names. And in that grind, Antonio learned to hide the pain. He didn't want to be seen as weak. He had once been called basketball guy. He wouldn't allow himself to be called injury-prone. So he gritted his teeth and endured. He practiced, even when his knees swelled. He played even when his back hurt so much every stride felt like a small knife. There were games where he scored touchdowns while his knee was already damaged from earlier. The crowd rose, cheered, commentators praised his toughness. But back in the locker room, he sat quietly, ice packs around the joint, feeling every pulse of his body crying for help. Success didn't lessen the pain. It only gave him less right to talk about it. Imposter syndrome made him fear being exposed as someone who didn't belong. His body made him fear something else, that one day he wouldn't be able to keep pretending he was still okay. Some nights after games, he couldn't sleep because his back throbbed. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer he could keep this up. But the next morning, he still showed up on the practice field like a man with no cracks at all. The NFL machine doesn't care how long you've dreamed or how much you sacrificed. It only cares if you can execute the task. And Antonio Gates, with the will forged in Detroit, kept stepping into that machine every week. He knew exactly the price he was paying, but he also knew that if he stopped, all those old fears would come rushing back. The fear of being erased from the map, the fear of being forgotten. So he chose to endure, not because he didn't feel the pain, but because he felt it too clearly, and he decided that if he had to be crushed, he would be crushed while scoring points, while fighting, while proving he wasn't a mistake of fate. The crowd saw victories. Antonio Gates saw his body paying for every round of applause, bit by bit. And then came 2015, the year Antonio Gates realized it wasn't just his body that could be crushed. Reputation could be too. The news hit suddenly, coldly, without warning. He was suspended by the NFL for violating league policy. No further explanation needed. The headline did enough damage. 15 years of dedication, 15 years of playing through pain, 15 years of building an image as a professional, disciplined man. And now his name appeared in reports tied to one different keyword: violation. The phone rang again. But this time it wasn't for congratulations, not for honors. It was questions. It was doubt. It was TV analysts, cold tweets, experts talking about a Sten legacy. The media didn't care about the mornings he couldn't straighten his back. They cared about the event, about the story. And the story right now was Antonio Gates, one of the greatest tight ends, had messed up. That feeling was like being blacked out in broad daylight. Not because he believed he was a bad guy, but because he understood how the world works. One negative headline can overshadow thousands of positive ones before it. One missed season can create space for someone else to step in. And for a man who had spent his whole life fearing replacement, fearing being exposed as someone who didn't belong, this news wasn't just a suspension. It was the old nightmare returning in a new form. Antonio didn't react loudly. He didn't hold dramatic press conferences. He didn't point fingers, but in the silence, he felt the weight pressing hard on his shoulders. Would 15 years of playing be reduced to one footnote? Would those red zone touchdowns be remembered with a question mark? Would the people who once believed in him start doubting? He had spent his entire career proving he deserved to exist in the NFL. Now he had to prove he deserved to be trusted. The suspended weeks dragged on slowly. Instead of taking the field, he trained alone. Instead of hearing cheers, he heard his shoes echo on the empty gym floor. He watched his team's games from afar, helplessness rising every time he saw the spot he used to occupy. Not because he thought he couldn't come back, but because he feared this stretch of time was long enough for people to forget him. In the NFL, memory is short, and he was far too familiar with being forgotten once in his life. When the suspension ended, Antonio returned to the field not as a welcomed hero, but as someone who had to redeem himself. Not redemption before the law, but redemption before his own image. He didn't celebrate big when he was activated back onto the roster. He just quietly walked into the locker room, strapped on his helmet again, and prepared for the game like every time before. Then the moment came. Red zone, the place where he had built his name. Philip Rivers looked his way. No grand declarations, no separate spotlight, just a familiar ball trajectory. Antonio ran his route, shook the defender in an instant, and hauled in the ball in the end zone. Touchdown. The stands erupted, but the roar wasn't as loud as before. For him, it wasn't a huge victory. It was a quiet salvation. He didn't raise his arms too high, no flashy celebration. He just clutched the ball tight, took a deep breath, and walked toward the sideline. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about stats. He was thinking about the silent weeks, thinking about the headlines, thinking about the fear that a 15-year legacy could be shrunk down to one mistake. That touchdown didn't erase the past, but it reminded him that his story wasn't over yet. The day his name was questioned, that wasn't just the day the press talked. It was the day he faced his deepest fear head-on, that everything could be taken away. And when he came back with a touchdown, quietly, without drama, it wasn't a challenge to the world. It was a reminder to himself that he was still here, that the years of enduring, the painful mornings, the doubts weren't meaningless, and that no matter how many question marks were placed next to his name, he would answer the only way he knew: step into the red zone and catch the ball like his whole life depended on it. After the day his name was put under a question mark, many thought it would be the beginning of the decline. But the years that followed weren't the story of a single season. They were multiple consecutive seasons, the years Antonio Gates took the field with a body no longer whole, but with a will still fully on fire. His knees never truly went back to the way they were. His back still ached quietly every time he had to twist suddenly. There were weeks during the season when he didn't complete a single full practice. Thursday off. Friday, just light movement. Sunday, he still played. Fans saw number 85 run into the red zone, still leap between two defenders, still keep balance in tight spaces. But they didn't see what happened from Monday to Saturday: ice packs, physical therapy, tape jobs, pain meds, mornings holding the wall just to walk down the stairs. Not just one season, not just one injury. It was accumulation. The NFL doesn't allow you to be weak. You can hurt, but you can't let the hurt become the reason. If you don't take the field, someone else is ready to take your place. And for a man who had spent his youth terrified of being replaced, Antonio wasn't going to wait for that moment to arrive. There were games where he played with knees more swollen than usual. There were catches after which he rose a beat slower, but still clapped to encourage teammates like nothing was wrong. Commentators talked about veteran savvy. They talked about the durability of a legend. But in his head, the story was simpler. If I stopped now, I might never get back. He accepted a truth no one wants to admit. His body would never return to perfect condition. The explosive early years were gone. Now it was the phase of pain management, of conserving every stride in practice to save energy for Sunday, of understanding he couldn't win with speed like before, but had to win with experience, with feel for space, with chemistry with the quarterback. Some nights after games, he sat alone in the nearly empty locker room, unwrapping layer after layer of tape from his knees. Red indentations marked his skin. He looked down at his legs and knew every passing year meant one less in the future. But he kept signing contracts, kept stepping onto the field. Not because he was obsessed with becoming a legend, not because he wanted more titles etched into his bio. He fought so he wouldn't be replaced. That emotion is completely different from grand ambition. Grand ambition seeks the spotlight. Fear of being replaced seeks mere existence. Antonio had once been overlooked by the NBA. He knew how quickly you can vanish from the map. So, when his body started sending signals that it was time to stop, he asked himself again, if I stop now, am I erasing my name once more? In those final career years, he was no longer the fastest on the field, but he was the one who best understood the tiny gaps between two defenders. He knew when to slow down to shake coverage. He knew when to use his frame to shield the ball. It was no longer the football of youth. It was the football of survival. The crowd still cheered when he scored touchdowns. They talked about longevity. They talked about a great tight end still shining past 30. But Antonio knew every touchdown now was a small victory over time. Every completed game was one more week he beat his body's limits. The NFL is a body-crushing machine, but it's also a will-testing machine. And in the years he played through pain, Antonio Gates wasn't fighting to be called a Hall of Famer. He was fighting so that Monday morning he was still on the roster. So the next Sunday, he still had a chance to step into the red zone. The years he played through pain weren't a romantic chapter. It was the chapter of raw truth. Glory always comes with a bill. And Antonio Gates paid that bill with every joint, every stiff morning, every pre-game injection. Not to prove he was great, but to prove he wasn't ready to disappear. Then came a day without the collisions. No helmets, no knee tape, no Saturday morning strategy meetings. Antonio Gates retired, and that, more than any injury, became the biggest hit of his life. For nearly 2 decades, his life had been measured by the schedule. September was the start. December was the peak. January was hope or an ending. His body could hurt. His mind could tire. But there was always another game to look toward. And then, suddenly, there were no more games. No more crowds. No more cheers crashing into his chest like waves. No more stadium lights shining down on number 85. And most importantly, no more adrenaline. Adrenaline had been what got him up after tackles. What blurred the knee pain in decisive moments? What made him forget he'd had pre-game shots? When the whistle blew, his body felt jolted awake by an invisible current. But after retirement, Sunday mornings became terrifyingly quiet. No warm-ups. No last-minute tactics in the meeting room. Just coffee and silence. The crisis didn't arrive loudly. It came quietly, like those mornings he once couldn't straighten his back. Antonio got out of bed with far less intense pain than before, but also with no clear purpose anymore. He had lived inside a body-crushing machine. Now his body rested, but his mind didn't. His identity for 16 seasons had been Chargers tight end, the red zone catcher, Philip Rivers' partner, Pro Bowler, All-Pro, part of the NFL All-Decade team. But when he no longer took the field, those titles became the past. And the question returned just as it had after the NBA draft night. If not that, then who am I? On the outside, Antonio Gates was a success story. Interviews, events, Congratulations. Events. Congratulations. TV breakdowns replaying the impressive numbers: 955 receptions, more than 11,800 yards, 116 touchdowns. People called him a future Hall of Famer. They said he changed how the tight end position was viewed. They praised the journey from basketball to the NFL as legendary, but inside he was searching for himself again. No more training schedules. No more coaches calling his name. No more teammates around. The years he fought not to be replaced had ended, and now a different fear appeared, the fear of being forgotten. Some days he turned on the TV to watch old games, saw himself younger, faster, stronger, saw the red zone catch that made the stadium explode, and then he turned it off. Not because he wasn't proud, but because he realized that moment was gone. Adrenaline no longer surged through his veins the way it used to. In its place was an emptiness not easy to fill. Retirement forced him to face the truth he had once postponed by showing up every week. He wasn't just a player, but for so many years he had lived as if that was his entire self. This double life was no longer between the spotlight and the fear of being an imposter. It was between the public image of a legend and the inner world of a man learning to live without the roar. Some mornings, he sat alone longer than usual. No more knee pain, but also no more reason to tape up. No more film study to find mistakes. No more proving anything to coaches. The freedom that should have brought relief instead brought the question: what am I going to fight for now? In the NFL, he fought not to be replaced. After retirement, no one was trying to replace him. But the world kept moving. Younger tight ends emerged. New records were set. Rosters updated. And Antonio understood no one is immortal in this league. The fear after the cheers stopped wasn't fear of poverty, not fear of financial failure. It was fear of losing direction. For 20 years, he lived two lives, one in the light, one in the shadows of doubt. Now the light went out, and he had to learn how to exist without it. The fear after the cheers stopped wasn't a loud tragedy. It was a silent emptiness. A man once used to hearing his name echo over the PA now had to call his own name in silence. And perhaps this was the greatest challenge. Not enduring hits, not scoring more touchdowns, but finding out who he was when no stadium was waiting anymore. But amid the emptiness after retirement, there was one place Antonio Gates never allowed himself to fall: his family. Throughout the playing years, when stadium lights shone and cheers drowned out everything, he kept his private life separate from the noise. No scandals, no sensational headlines, no public drama, just a man coming home after games, setting his bag down, unwrapping knee tape, and trying to be a normal dad. Antonio never wanted his kids to see him as a legend. He wanted them to see him as dad. The guy in the stands at school performances. The patient one explaining homework. The listener to the small but important stories of childhood. He stepped onto the field covered in bruises, but when he walked through the front door, he left the NFL machine behind. Some evenings after games, when his body ached so much he just wanted to lie down, he still sat and played with the kids. Still picked them up even with a sore back. Still smiled even with swollen knees. Not because he wasn't tired, but because he didn't want pain to become part of their childhood memories. He knew exactly what it was like to grow up in an environment that promised no gentleness. He didn't want his kids to see the darkness he carried. Throughout his career, Antonio learned how not to let anyone see him bleed both literally and figuratively. On the field, he got up a beat faster after every tackle so no one knew how much it hurt. At home, he hid the sleepless nights from back pain, hid the worries about contracts, about performance, about the future. Family wasn't the place to bring the weight of the NFL. There were times he sat in the car before walking inside, taking deep breaths to reset his emotions. Not because he feared his family, but because he wanted to walk in with a lighter mindset. He didn't want his kids to feel the pressure from the media, from tense seasons, from injuries the press never mentioned. He had lived two lives, one in the light, one in the shadows. But with family, he tried to create a space where no shadows spilled in, no noise, no show. Antonio didn't build a perfect dad image for the media. He simply showed up. In ordinary evenings, in moments with no cameras. And that quiet presence was the hardest part, because sometimes the strongest person isn't the one shouting about victories, but the one silently enduring so others don't have to endure with him. After retirement, when the identity crisis quietly arrived, family became the anchor. But he still didn't allow himself to collapse in front of them. If he felt empty without the cheers, he kept it to himself. If he worried about the future, he handled it in private conversations, not at the dinner table. He didn't want his kids growing up with memories of a dad who was lost. He wanted them to remember a dad who was steady, a man who never let you see him bleed. That wasn't an exaggerated heroic image. It was a choice, the choice to keep the pain to himself, to protect the ones he loved. The choice not to turn wounds into shared burdens. Antonio Gates may have fought on the field for pride, for position, for existence. But at home, he fought for peace. In a world where scandals often follow fame, he chose quiet. In a league where egos easily inflate, he chose humility. And perhaps his deepest legacy isn't just in the touchdowns or records. It lies in the unseen moments where a man hurt but still smiled, tired but still listened, and for 20 years never let his family see him bleed. Family was where he hid the pain. In the locker room, Antonio Gates hid it in a different way through silence. He wasn't the guy standing in the circle yelling slogans. Not the one slamming lockers to fire everyone up. The NFL is full of loud voices, full of explosive personalities. Antonio wasn't that type. He led differently through presence, through always being there, through taking the field even when his body wasn't whole anymore. In the Chargers locker room, there were young players stepping in with bright eyes and bodies without scars yet. They talked loud, they laughed loud. They believed they were invincible. Antonio looked at them and saw himself years earlier before his knees started creaking, before his back stiffened every morning, before the media put question marks next to his name. He didn't snuff out that confidence. He just quietly showed them the real price of this profession. He arrived early, left late, sat in meetings and took careful notes, not because he didn't understand the playbook, but because he knew the young players were watching. Not when he scored touchdowns, but when he prepared in silence. Leadership doesn't always need a lot of words. Sometimes it just needs consistency. Others can lean on. There were games when the lineup was chaotic. Mistakes piled on mistakes. Frustration spread like dry fire. And amid that chaos, Antonio didn't yell. He just stepped close to the quarterback, said a few short words. "We've still got time. Do our jobs." His voice wasn't loud. But because he had paid the highest price with his body and his years, his words carried weight. The loneliness of the silent leader isn't about lacking friends. It's about no one truly understanding how much you're carrying. Teammates saw him score 116 touchdowns in his career. They saw him selected to the Pro Bowl 8 times. They saw his name mentioned as one of the greatest tight ends. But they didn't see the mornings he had to sit longer than usual before standing up. Didn't see the weeks he limited practice just to save energy for Sunday. Leading with loud words gets noticed. Leading through endurance often gets overlooked. Antonio was the second kind. He didn't need to prove he was a leader. He just needed to take the field. Every time he stood in the starting lineup while in pain, that was a message. Every time he caught the ball in crucial situations past 30, that was a reminder that standards never drop. But the price of that kind of leadership is loneliness. He didn't share all his worries with teammates, Didn't talk much about imposter syndrome. Didn't talk about the fear of being replaced. He kept them inside, partly by instinct, partly because he believed a leader shouldn't let his fears spread through the locker room. Some evenings after games, when the locker room had emptied, Antonio stayed a little longer, listened to the soft hum of the laundry machines, listened to the last footsteps leave the hallway. He didn't stay for attention. He stayed because he needed a moment to breathe, to remind himself he was still here, that he had survived one more week in this machine. The silent leader isn't someone without emotions. He just doesn't let emotions control the team. He knows the NFL is a place where weakness, if shown the wrong way, can spread faster than motivation. So he chose to be the wall. Steady, reliable, quiet, but always there. And perhaps that's the hardest kind of leadership. Not remembered for fiery speeches, not honored for explosive locker room moments, but remembered for durability, for enduring the most while never demanding anyone see it. In a world of shouting and spotlights, Antonio Gates led through quiet, and in that quiet, he carried all the pain, all the doubt, all the years fighting not to be replaced, without ever letting anyone see him bleed. The silence in the locker room, the endurance through pain, the years fighting not to be replaced, all of that didn't just build a career. It built a legacy. And what makes Antonio Gates's legacy isn't a red carpet path. It was built from closed doors. He wasn't called in the NFL draft. He never played college football. He had no traditional resume to enter America's toughest league. In a system where talent is usually spotted early, drafted, ranked, honored through every round, Antonio Gates was the exception. And the NFL isn't designed to favor exceptions. It's designed to trust what's proven. Antonio didn't bring proof. He brought rejection. When the Chargers signed him as an undrafted free agent, it wasn't a sure investment. It was an experiment. But year after year, season after season, touchdown after touchdown, that experiment slowly became the new standard. Before Antonio Gates, the tight end position was often boxed into two roles, block or catch short. But he brought basketball thinking to the turf. He understood three-dimensional space. He understood using his body like a power forward in the paint. He knew how to box out defenders like fighting for a rebound. His contested catches weren't just football skill. They were the intersection of two worlds. The red zone became his territory. 116 career touchdowns, a number that once set the record for tight ends. Not thanks to elite receiver speed, not thanks to pure lineman power, but thanks to spatial positioning, reading movement, and balance under pressure. He didn't just play tight end, he expanded its definition. Later generations from versatile big tight ends who can block and run routes like receivers walked the path Antonio opened. Coaches started seeking multi-sport athletes. College basketball players started being considered for football potential. The door once closed to Antonio slowly cracked open for others. And that's the most beautiful part of his legacy. It wasn't built from privilege. It was built from rejection. Every time he stepped on the field without his name ever called in a draft, it was a reminder the system can be wrong. Every time he made the Pro Bowl, it was proof a non-traditional path doesn't mean invalid. Every time he was mentioned as one of the greatest tight ends, it was a complete reversal of the initial prejudice. But what gives that legacy depth isn't just stats. It's the psychological journey. Antonio Gates didn't enter the NFL with absolute confidence. He entered with imposter syndrome, with the fear of being exposed as a fraud. And for years, he didn't fight to become a legend. He fought not to be cut from the roster. That's why when people look back at his career, they don't just see an elite tight end. They see a symbol of resilience. A man once overlooked by the NBA, once undrafted by the NFL, once called basketball guy, but who still carved his name into league history. Legacy built from rejection isn't an empty inspirational slogan. It's Antonio Gates's reality. If he'd been drafted high, if he'd trained in football from childhood, if his path had been smoother, maybe he'd still have succeeded. But his legacy would be different. It would lack the depth of doubt, lack the weight of proving himself every day. Today, when his name comes up in Hall of Fame discussions, few remember he never played college football. Few remember he went undrafted. But those are the foundation. Antonio Gates didn't change the tight end position just with talent. He changed it by existing, by surviving, by refusing to let rejection define him. And that's the kind of legacy that can't be erased, because it didn't start under stadium lights. It started from closed doors. Antonio Gates's legacy didn't end when he left the field, but it also didn't continue in the loud way many expected. No big announcements, no packed media tours, no prominent shift to a weekly TV analyst role. His post-retirement life unfolded more quietly, almost the opposite of the spotlight he lived in for nearly 2 decades. He returned to Detroit more often, not to reminisce, but to be present. Those neighborhoods that once taught him lessons about discipline and survival are still there. The streets where basketball was once the only escape for a tall but sensitive boy haven't changed much. Antonio doesn't return as a hero flaunting his achievements. He returns as a man who deeply understands what it feels like to be overlooked. He gets involved in community activities, meets with teenagers, speaks at schools, not to brag about 116 touchdowns as some trophy, but to talk about the NBA draft night with no call, about going undrafted in the NFL, about the feeling of being erased from the map, and how he refused to let that be the end. He mentors young athletes, not just on technique, but on mindset, on facing doubt, on accepting that you might not follow the traditional path, and that doesn't make you any less valuable. He sees in those boys' eyes the eagerness, the youthful confidence, and the fear of failure. He recognizes himself in them. But even in those hopeful talks, Antonio still carries 2 things no one sees clearly: physical pain and the fear of being forgotten. His body hasn't forgotten 16 seasons. His knees don't suddenly revert to age 25 just because he's no longer playing. His back still reminds him every time the weather changes. There are mornings in Detroit when he wakes up in the quiet house, and the dull ache reminds him that the price of legacy is real. No more pre-game tape, no more painkiller shots to get through this week. Now he has to live with those remnants. He doesn't complain, doesn't post on social media about old pains, but every time he stands in front of young crowds and talks about second chances, he knows his body itself is proof of the battle fought. And the fear of being forgotten is subtler. The NFL is a machine that always moves forward. Every season brings new stars. Every year brings new records. Younger, faster tight ends, properly trained from college football, step onto the field with spotlights already waiting. Antonio isn't jealous, but he notices the rhythm of replacement. Sometimes, watching a game on TV, he hears commentators talk about the modern tight end generation without mentioning him, not because they're deliberately ignoring him, but because time simply works that way. And in that moment, a familiar feeling rises again, like that NBA draft night. Like 2015 when his name was put under a question mark. What if they forget me? That question doesn't break him, but it exists. He spent his entire career fighting not to be replaced. After retirement, no one is directly replacing him in the locker room, but collective memory can shift faster than any depth chart. So Antonio chooses a different way to endure, not by clinging to the spotlight, but by creating impact, in mentoring sessions, in community programs, in returning to Detroit to invest in the next generation. He isn't seeking loud recognition. He's seeking continuity. If one kid growing up in an environment that promises no gentleness hears his story and decides not to quit, that's another touchdown. Not on the scoreboard. But in real life, the life he never talked about isn't a dark secret. It isn't a hidden scandal, isn't a shocking truth the world never knew. The truth about Antonio Gates's double life isn't in deception. It's in how he survived. He didn't live two lives because he wanted to fool anyone. He lived two lives because he had to. One life to fight, one life to endure. On the field, he was the warrior, the man charging into the red zone amid brutal hits, catching between two defenders, getting up a beat faster so no one saw the pain. He played 16 seasons in a body-crushing machine without ever being called in the NFL draft, without a college football foundation, without a traditional path guiding him. Every week he stepped onto the field as if he still had to prove he belonged there. But off the field, he was the one who endured the fear of being exposed as a fraud despite 116 touchdowns, endured mornings when he couldn't straighten his back, endured the 2015 news when his name was questioned, endured the crisis when the cheers stopped and identity suddenly blurred. He never spoke loudly about those things, never built a triumph over adversity hero image on TV. He never let his family see him bleed, never let the locker room see his doubt, never let the media see his fear. His double life wasn't fake, it was a survival mechanism. In the NFL, if you show weakness, others see opportunity. In life, if fear takes control, you stop. Antonio learned to separate those two worlds. By day, he fought. By night, he faced the pain alone. And that's why his story isn't loud but heavy. He didn't enter the league as a coveted phenomenon. He entered as a gamble. Undrafted, ungranteed, unguaranteed, unprioritized. He built his career from rejection. He changed the tight end position not because the system believed in him, but because he refused to leave the system. His legacy doesn't come from perfection. He was once suspended. He was once in pain. He once doubted himself. He once feared being forgotten. But he never ran away. When his body started breaking down bit by bit, he still took the field. When his name was questioned, he answered with a quiet touchdown. When the cheers stopped, he didn't try to cling to the light. He found a way to live in the shadows without losing himself. Antonio Gates isn't a legend because he was perfect. He's a legend because he was steadfast. Because he stayed when leaving would have been easiest. Because he understood being erased from the map and chose to carve his name back with sweat, with pain, with Sundays no one knew he had to inject before games. Some legends are remembered for dominating from start to finish. Antonio is remembered for surviving, for turning rejection into foundation, for turning fear into fuel, for fighting not to become an icon, but to not disappear. And perhaps the most tragic yet noblest thing is this. For 20 years, millions stood and cheered when he scored touchdowns. But very few knew that behind every catch was a man wondering if he was good enough. That behind every smile was a body calculating the price paid. That behind the image of success was a mind always on guard against replacement. The truth about his double life doesn't make him smaller. It makes him more human. Antonio Gates isn't a legend because he never fell. He's a legend because every time he fell, he got back up even when no one saw him bleed. And even when no one knew how much pain he was in, he still stepped into the red zone, opened his hands, and caught the ball like it was his last chance to prove he deserved to exist. Antonio Gates's story makes people both proud and heartbroken. Behind 116 touchdowns, 8 Pro Bowls, and the unbreakable image in the red zone, is a man who was never called in the NFL draft, never played college football, and entered the league as a gamble. We see him leap between two defenders, but we don't see the mornings he couldn't straighten his back, the pre-game injections, or the obsession with being exposed as an imposter despite becoming one of the greatest tight ends in history. In 2015, when he was suspended and the media put question marks next to his 15-year legacy, it wasn't just an image crisis, it was the return of the psychological crack from that NBA draft night with no call. And after retirement, when the cheers stopped, he faced another emptiness. No more adrenaline, no more clear identity, but still chose to return to Detroit as a mentor, quietly lifting up the next generation. What makes us ache isn't that he failed, but that he endured so much in silence, hiding pain from his family, leading the locker room without shouting, fighting not to become a legend, but to not be replaced. For Americans, this story reminds us that success doesn't always come from a pre-paved path. Sometimes it's built from rejection. And a person's worth isn't in being perfect, but in not running away when doubted, when the body hurts, when the applause has faded. If the story of Antonio Gates' quiet but resilient journey has touched you, hit subscribe to the channel so we can keep exploring together the great people behind the spotlight. Thank you for listening to the end, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue telling stories not just about victories, but about hearts that never gave up.